And welcome to today's FX Cuppa Club. Thanks so much for joining us. My name's Jerome Heusinger. I'm Senior Development Manager here at FX, and I'll be hosting today's Cuppa Club. If you are new to FX, we're a direct impact investment platform that connects people with high impact organizations creating positive change in communities across the UK. Our investor community helps fund businesses and projects tackling some of today's biggest social and environmental challenges. And today we're spotlighting one such organization, Solar for Schools CBS. We're delighted to be joined by its CEO, Robert Schrimpf, who'll be talking about the latest Solar for Schools ISA bond offer. I should mention that this is the 14th offer on the FX platform. This is an affiliation that we are extremely proud of. Before we get started, there's some housekeeping to do. We'd like to let you know that the Cuppa Club is recorded and made to watch on FX's YouTube channel, and we also edit this to a highlighted version. This is not a financial promotion, and if you do need advice, please discuss it with an independent financial advisor. The Cuppa Club usually runs for around 30 minutes. We'll keep the conversation informal, and there will be plenty of time at the end for your questions, so feel free to pop those in the chat as we go. So with that, welcome, Robert. Welcome back, Robert. Please remind us what you do and what Solar for Schools is all about.
Well, thank you. And also, thanks for achieving the 2 million so quickly. It was a sort of bit of a debate as to whether we should even have this session, but I think it is good that we're having it because we need to raise quite a lot more money this year. So we'll continue doing so. So thank you to your team for getting there so quickly. And then back to your question as to what does Solar for Schools do? So we set up the Solar for Schools Community Benefit Society 8 years ago now, in order to fund schools that could not otherwise go solar. And it does so by raising money from ethical investors, typically parents and grandparents all over the country who want to help a school. That money is then combined with grants. For example, the National Grid provides us or schools that we work with about $500,000 a year. And that's then used for typically smaller schools that would otherwise not meet the sort of financial hurdle and savings required for the school. So we use up to £25,000 to top up each project from the National Grid, combine that with money from bondholders, develop the project, build the project, and then look after it for the next 25 years. One of the key differences with the Solar for Schools CBS and other community energy groups out there is that because it's not geographically specific, it's anywhere in the country, it kind of fills the gaps in all the areas around the country where there isn't a local community energy group. And so that's its kind of main focus. It allows schools that are outside of other community energy groups' area of coverage to go solar. And because it's a UK-wide organization, the profits that accrue or the surpluses that accrue in the CBS will ultimately go back to the school and the community around each of those schools rather than a specific geographical location.
Could you, so £2 million has been raised. Could you walk people through the impact that this particular raise will create? In terms of education, in terms of electricity costs saved for a school, and CO2 generally.
Yeah, so £2 million is enough, about 2 megawatts of solar. In fact, we managed to stretch it a bit further than that because of the grants that we use too. But if we did 2 megawatts of solar, let's say just over 2 megawatts, to say 2.4, that would generate about 2 gigawatt hours of electricity a year, which would save, and now I need to get my numbers right. I should have done the calculations, but it's a typical school will save 6 to 25 tons of CO2 a year as a result of going solar, depending on the system size. But because of the education work that Solar Options for Schools does with each of these schools, where we go into the school once a year to show them the educational materials that we provide online that link the data from the generation. So there's a nice little daily curve of how much electricity has been generated, but we also include data on what the school's consuming so that estate managers and students can understand what's going on in the school in terms of their electricity consumption and try and reduce that to increase their savings. And that education interaction, we think, will save up to 10 times as much CO2. And if you imagine one of these young people who currently is a bit scared about climate change, a bit worried about it, but doesn't know what to do about it, we go in, we explain electricity, we explain where carbon comes from, we explain why installing solar panels can help, why not driving a fossil fuel car can help, and they then go home and potentially persuade their parents to change their behavior. If you think of a small primary where we might be saving 6 tons from the solar panels, if each of the 120 students go back and talk to their parents, it's quite easy to imagine that each family could reduce their carbon footprint by a ton simply by either electrifying their transport or not flying as much on holiday.
Could you discuss the bill savings aspect of it? Because there's this sort of triple whammy really of impact, and the bill savings for individual schools is another leg.
Yeah, so the reason we try and raise money at as low a possible cost of capital is it has a direct one-to-one conversion to how much the school would have to pay for the electricity from the solar panels to repay bondholders over the 25-year period and cover the interest costs. And 5% interest costs over 20 years adds up now because on a declining balance basis. But if it weren't, it would be as much as the capital in the first place. In reality, it's more like 2/3 of the initial capital. But if one can keep the interest costs as low as possible and one can bring in other grants, which we do, and we heard today from another DSO who wants to provide grants for batteries, which will help improve the economics too. We combine that to try and provide the school with as low as possible PPA. PPA stands for Power Purchase Agreement. That's the price they pay per unit of solar electricity they consume from the panels that bondholders fund. And the target is to try and get that as low as possible. In reality, for a large school, you might get it down to about 15p. For a small school without any grants, you're looking at 22 or 23p, which is more than they currently pay. With a grant, we can then bring it down to about 17p, and then they're saving 3 or 4p per unit of electricity. What does that translate to? For a small primary, it might be a couple of £1,000s a year, but over the next 25 years, that will increase as mains electricity continues to rise. So they might save 50 to 100,000 pounds over the lifetime. And for a larger school, it could be £250,000 to £500,000 quite easily. And for some of the larger schools, they'll say over £1 million over the lifetime of the system. So the impact is proportional to the size of the system, and that's proportional to the size of the school.
Okay, so that's punchy. So having dealt with impact, let's deal with the financials. So what can you say to investors? This is a 5-year bond. How will they be repaid in 5 years' time? How do you model that? How do you think about it? And how can you reassure people as to the fact that will happen?
Yeah. So we model so it works backwards. The price that the school will pay for a unit of electricity is calculated based on how much electricity the system will generate, how much of that electricity will be consumed by the school, and how much goes back to the grid. We don't get very much when it goes back to the grid, so we assume a very low value for that. It then works out how much the school would have to pay per unit so that over the 25-year lifetime, it generates enough income back to the CBS to cover the repayment of those loans, the interest on those loans, and us to look after also options for schools to look after the system and pay for any repairs or spare parts. It also covers insurance and rates. And that's calculated in such a way that there's a little bit of extra buffer there to protect against the system shutting down for 6 months if they're re-roofing or the cost of doing so. But there's enough in there calculated that over 23 years, the loan will be repay itself. Now, in reality, the bonds are only for 5 years. And so one of the challenges we have to manage is that every 5 years, we ask those bondholders, do you want your money back or would you like to reinvest for another 5 years? And in the latest situation in November, 2.5 million of bonds were coming up for repayment. We sent out a survey, and in the end, just over half of them decided to reinvest for another 5 years, and half of them were repaid in the first week of November. And we then raised more money to cover that up. So every 5 years we refinance, but we won't have to refinance the original amount because it will be on a smaller basis, right? We'll have repaid some of it in the form of reinvesting in more projects effectively. And so every 5 years we have to refinance a smaller amount for that portfolio until after the lifetime, the 23 years or so, it's been fully repaid. In order to reduce our risk on refinancing, because that's one of the sort of things that some people worry about, what happens if in 5 years' time when we need to refinance 60% of what's left, because some people will reinvest anyway, what happens if we can't raise the money from new bondholders or a bank? So two things. One, worst case scenario is that we just then go back to repaying people gradually over the lifetime of the assets. So worst case is we repay everyone over the 23-year periods. In reality, what will happen is that some people will have an urgency for the money and will get paid first, and other people will be in no hurry to it and will get paid towards the end, and we can balance it out. And we also have, quite a lot of income coming in, so we can adjust it. So far, anyone's requested early repayment, we've managed to honor it within a few weeks. The other thing that we've done to reduce that risk is starting to bring banks on board. So Triodos invested 3 million last year and another 2.5 million this year. And some of that can be used to refinance, and that's the long-term plan, that you gradually replace bondholders who want to be repaid, not with new bondholders, they like to invest in new projects, but with a bank who actually likes to invest in projects that have been running for 5 years. And then you gradually replace your bondholders who've been there for long enough with bank for the rest of the period. So you've reduced your reliance on having to raise money from new bondholders to refinance existing bondholders.
Okay, that's very clear. So you, in the offer document, you described that you've recently celebrated your 200th school. You're now up to 220. If we look out for 3 to 5 years, what do you see? What's the potential for the CBS in terms of coverage?
That's a great question. So when we first started the CBS, and I was one of the sort of founding directors of the CBS, it was created literally as a sort of vehicle to fund projects that couldn't get funding in any other way. And we thought it might reach 5 megawatts in size and look after sort of 30 or 50 schools. It's approaching sort of 230 schools. We have another 70 or 80 schools in the pipeline. So we'll quickly pass the 300 mark over the next 12 to 18 months. But what's interesting is, as it's grown, the independent directors that sort of initially were sort of hands-on enough to provide some governance have actually taken on more of a active role. And last week, we spent 2 days discussing how to ensure the longevity of the CBS, how to stress test it in various different scenarios. We are approaching a point where we could arguably start to distribute some profits and surpluses back to schools, but we've decided we're actually going to try and keep them within the CBS to de-risk it and prepare for maybe some years won't be as good. This year we had a particularly sunny year and we're way ahead in terms of our revenues. We'll generate about 150,000 more in revenues than we were expecting to. One could distribute that windfall back, but the plan is to actually keep it and potentially repay bondholders a little bit sooner and make the economics better long term, or just make it more solid. But the other thing I was really excited was that it was the first time that as a group of directors, and I'm super grateful to the other directors who are all volunteers from various different walks of life. We've got 2 new directors. One's a lawyer, a former lawyer, and the other one's a former actuary, which is very good at sort of looking at long-term cash flows and risks. And so we're very glad to have them on board to help us with governance and long-term sort of risk management. And we sort of came up with a sort of draft of what's the sort of the vision for the CBS itself. And we sort of settled on sort of steady growth. We're not going to continue accelerating. I think we're going to sort of settle down to about 6 megawatts a year, which is about 60 to 80 schools a year. And that would get us to about 500 schools and 50 megawatts under management by about 2030. And could we go faster than that? Probably. But we're also seeing a growing number of other community energy groups beginning to pop up in various different areas. So the gaps are becoming smaller, and we don't want to compete with other community energy groups. We want to sort of complement them and fill the gaps where they don't exist. And we think at about 6 megawatts a year, we can do that without competing with them.
And it's interesting that you're wearing your other hat, solar options for schools. You are actively helping and supporting those community energy groups. So your influence in this sector, if you like, is very significant.
Yeah, I should wear two hats really, on the CBS hat and a
Yeah.
different colored hat so sitting on this side at solar options. Yes, the solar options for schools ambition is much, much greater. Our original stated goal was to get to the point where we're helping 100,000 schools a year globally. That's proven to be much, 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 much harder than we thought because of my very bad joke of needing 20 people to put solar on a school, one to install and 19 to get out of the way first. Um, it's still very, very painful to get all the people who are doing their job and need to safeguard the school, obviously. It's very important that they safeguard the school to become comfortable with the idea of putting some solar panels on. And that was aggravated by the fact that we know of two fires and one sort of smoking inverter. To be fair, the smoking inverter was just coming to the end of its life, and when it dies, it does do a little puff of smoke. But the two fires are more scary. They're on the roofs. No one was hurt. Obviously, the roof was slightly damaged, and the solar panels were, wiped out. But that makes councils, who are the ultimate owners of the buildings, and it's their responsibility. And so you can quite imagine you turn up to a uh, uh, a council and say we want to put some solar panels on your roof, and they've just heard that council down the road has had a fire on it. They're a little bit nervous. So getting that and persuading all these people is hard work, and spreading that load between more of us helps. And so over the last 18 months, we've increasingly been working with more community energy groups, not just Solar for Schools CBS, but we've been working with York Community Energy Group. We're working with Milton Keynes, who's just preparing to do a bond offer on ethics. So we've been going through the financials model with them. We've been doing all the development work for them. We're just starting to work with or talk to Kent in the view of potentially helping them develop more projects. They've just raised successfully on ethics too. And so over the coming years, options for schools will be focusing on providing the tools, techniques, and services we developed to build the CBS to becoming the sort of school CBS to becoming the largest owner of school assets, solar assets on schools, and using those techniques, that software platform, those processes to help other community energy groups also start to scale up and achieve more, and do so in a robust and safe manner.
Okay, thanks. And to sort of highlight your prominence in this sector, I see that you're hosting a parliamentary showcase next week. Could you say a little about that? And
Yes.
why you do that and what the value of it is?
Yeah. I'm not very politically driven, probably to uh, my mistake. But one of my colleagues is, and it became clear that if you want to get 19 people to say yes more quickly, you can't tackle them individually. You have to tackle it at a sort of collective social level. And so we've been working with the DFE on and off for years. And we also spoke to GB Energy very early in their sort of discovery process. And when we showed them the potential of schools in the UK, they're very excited. I'm not sure if as a result of that conversation, but possibly as a result of that conversation and many others since, the initiative by the GB Energy to fund solar on schools was born. And some of these conversations, you kind of need to get all the right people in the room at the same time. And our parliamentary event is that opportunity. We managed to sort of get MPs to come and see and meet some of the students that we've worked with. The students then present to the MPs and ministers what they've learned and explain a little bit about the process of how they went solar and how it all works. And it increases the awareness of it. And it's been incredibly helpful engaging with MPs who've then gone back into their constituencies and talk to the councillors, and the councillors in turn talk to the people in the council, and it just gets the wheels to move a little bit faster. And it's been a very interesting experience watching the GB Energy project and how that's being rolled out. They've chosen what at first sight seems the most logical thing to do, which is to work through the DFE. The DFE is in charge of all the schools in the UK. Why wouldn't you work with them? Slight small snag is that actually the building owners and are not the DFE in most cases. It's the local council. And so you need to get them on board. Having the DFE endorsing it only gets you so far. And we're fortunate enough to have won 40 of the schools that have been funded by GB Energy to develop and build those, alongside with a very large, experienced government contractor working for the DFE directly. We work for them. So we've got a sort of large consultancy arm on top of us, keeping an eye on us and double checking all the extra paperwork that we need to do. But it provides a bit of robustness and lots of lessons learned in terms of how the government could help more solar on more schools. And as part of the Net Zero Pathfinder, as the DFE calls it, I'm sure there'll be lots of lessons from this first funding of a large number of schools through GB Energy to working on possibly more efficient ways of doing it in future that work alongside community energy groups and councils to achieve the same objective, possibly in a slightly less painful way. So I'm delighted that the government and GB Energy have chosen to invest in this space, because it makes all the sense in the world to put solar panels on schools. And hopefully they will learn from this first experiment on how we can do it slightly less painfully going forward.
Yeah. So we're all, look, this is all very new. Lots of new people, lots of new positions, but very well funded. So we're all learning. In 2 or 3 years' time, what's the ideal set of circumstances with regard to your CBS and GB Energy? What's the ideal template for that to really work and generate maximum impact?
So the conversations we've been having with GB Energy in the early days were around using their funding to crowd in community energy funding and de-risk community energy funding. So where GB Energy fits in really well is that they cover some of the costs of the initial development work. So for example, at the moment, options takes the risk of developing projects. And if those projects don't happen, we don't make any money to cover those costs. And we sometimes might invest 18 months to 2 years in developing a project, which then doesn't happen. Reducing the number of projects that don't happen would allow more people to take the risk of developing them. And that would massively accelerate the problem. And the way GB Energy did it this way is a lot of projects that they've suddenly funded were projects that someone else had been developing for 19 months or 18 months, and they've just been sort of snatched away from them, which is not very helpful. In future, and there are direction of travel in terms of conversation, is that GB Energy will work with combined authorities and councils to pre-pay for the development work in some cases, and where a community energy then can't fund it entirely because the economics don't stack up and the school is too small or it needs some additional scaffolding or something, that they will then top up the difference to provide enough buffer for bondholders to be safe and the hurdle rates required for bondholders to be met, but equally still provide a saving to the schools. And in that way, the roughly 2 billion that GB Energy has set aside for funding solar, they could use a fraction of it, yet all schools could go solar, because it then allows community energy groups and bondholders and individuals in the public to invest in what are very safe assets if done properly, and then crowd in potentially 1 billion from individuals who want to make a difference.
Yeah, that sounds like a very elegant and logical endpoint. I wanted to ask you about grants. Can you say a little bit about the National Grid grant, to how, to what extent has that been utilised,
Yeah,
and scope for more, scope for grants from others?
yeah. So that's something that's changing quite dramatically in the last 2, 3 years. Um, so the National Grid approached us 2.5 years ago. They had 500,000 that they wanted to sort of basically give systems away to schools, small systems to schools. And we said that's a lovely idea, but we won't help you do it. And the reason we won't help you do it is that if you give a system away to school, one, you're only going to give a very small system away. And two, they won't appreciate it and look after it. And after 2 or 3 years, it'll stop working, and then that's it. And so you'll basically given away a whole bunch of systems that after a few years probably won't work. And all the people who were thinking of buying or funding or doing their own won't do it because they now wait for to get a free one. And so they said, well, what would you do instead? And we said, well, what you could do is we could use your money to top up projects that wouldn't otherwise work, but still get the school to sign up to power purchase agreement. That means they get a bill every quarter that reminds them they've got solar panels on their roof. It enables us to then go in and look after that system properly and then provide the education piece. And to their credit, they went off and thought about it and came back and said, yeah, we agree with you. And we don't just want to do it with you and a few other people. We want to do it exclusively with solar options for schools. So we currently allocate that budget to not just the CBS projects, but if the school wants to fund it themselves or partly fund it themselves, or any other community energy group. But we're using our software platform, we can then work out how much grant to allocate to a particular project. And that same mechanism could be used by GB Energy to allocate grants nationwide to projects in future. And that same mechanism is now being explored by two other DSOs who want to provide
Sorry,
fund.
Robert, DSO.
Oh, sorry, District Service Operator, I think they're called. They used to be
Thank
called DNOs. So you've got the national grid that covers the entire country, and then you've got local grid operators, of which in our case with the national grid, we're talking to the ones who cover sort of a swath of the UK going across sort of diagonally from bottom left to top right. But we've got lots of other areas where we've got other DSOs where we could do with grants. So we're beginning to persuade, we've got two more that are now committing. In fact, this morning, one of them committed to at least £25,000 this side of Christmas to help a school, which is great. But we're also seeing interest, and this is very interesting, from data centers. So Amazon, Apple, Facebook have had conversations with us in the past around how they could help fund solar on schools and get the exported electricity back to them so they can get that as a credit to power their data centers. Those conversations are still quite early days, but I think there's a growing opportunity to get additional grants from larger corporates.
Interesting one. Um, Good. Look, I think I th you're very well known. As I mentioned, this is the 14th offer.
Oddly.
Lord knows how many times we've talked to each other on this forum. But if there's one thing you'd like investors and supporters to take away from today's conversation, what would it be?
I think if you have any influence with the council, um, getting them to see examples or of how it's worked in other areas is super powerful. And the more people who talk to the estates team in a council or the councillor in their region and say, look, why don't more of your schools have solar? And they, well, we haven't got any budget. And they say, well, you don't need a budget. That there are plenty of people out there prepared to fund it. It just needs to be done properly and efficiently. And so just if you can spot ways to help the most powerful way you could help a school near you to go solar is yes, obviously funding it either through the Community Benefit Society or some other community benefit society locally. But it's sort of getting the council to move a little bit quicker and put some time and attention on it. I mean, they eventually get there. It's just a question of trying to get enough people in the room to sit down and think about it for long enough.
Yeah. Okay. I think we got to the end of this. Thanks for your time. Just a reminder that the latest Solar for Schools If ISA bond offer is now live. We have to say that it has hit its initial target of £2 million. But Robert, could you just explain what the maximum is and why?
So over the next year, and I noticed we've got a question in the chat, which
Yeah,
I'd
yeah, but
like to
perhaps we
help.
can get to Rob's
Um,
question as well.
and welcome many more questions from anyone. This is the questions are the interesting bit for me, so please do ask questions. So on your no, I've forgotten your question. The oh yeah,
What's
the
the
2.5 million, the
maximum?
2 million. So we probably need to raise well, the CBS needs to raise or will deploy about £5 million, £5 to £6 million in 2026. This raise, if it goes all the way up to the 2.5 million maximum cap, of which 1.3 is refinancing, so it's 1.2 million of new money, plus what we've raised from Triodos, means that we have roughly 1.8 million towards the sort of 6 megawatts, £5 million that we need this year. Now, the system generates cash flow, and because we're not repaying it instantly, we reinvest it in more projects. That will probably cover nearly a megawatt's worth, but we'll need to raise another 2.5 million this year, and we want to do that through bonds rather than banks, given that Triodos is now at 5.5 million. So this is the first raise, and it'll continue to run into January and February to get to the 2.5 million, and then there'll be another raise, possibly for shares rather than bonds later in the year.
Okay, just a correction. This is scheduled to run to the end of January.
Sorry, end of January. Yeah, 2 more months
Yeah.
from now. Yeah.
And just to sort of Rob has sent a couple of very interesting questions. One, how concerned are you about the Treasury's attitude to roof leases? And then secondly, how do you navigate local authority procurement rules?
Both very, very good questions. So the Treasury one, which is one of the reasons this year was so hellish, um, was partly a storm in a teacup. And the funny thing is, if you go and ask Treasury, they say it was the DFE, and if you go and ask the DFE, they say it was Treasury. So neither one wants to admit to having caused the storm. Um, but what there is an underlying grain of concern, and that is that some of the commercial PPAs out there that have been applied to not just schools but public sector buildings have something called contingent liabilities. And it will say somewhere in the contract something along the lines of if the school is shut down, you have to repay the remaining value of that system. And that is a liability. And Treasury goes, oh, hang on a minute. That's a liability if it's a liability that's on Treasury, and therefore it needs to go into the public's loan book. The CBS doesn't have contingent liabilities in any of its contracts. So that they're not a problem from that perspective. But actually, I think that Treasury and the DFE should work towards enabling certain contingent liabilities to be in there. Because one of the biggest risks that a community energy group, and I mean, the CBS is big enough, doesn't really matter if we lose a couple of projects, right? But if you're a small community energy group, you've got 5 or 6 schools, and one of them, the building gets demolished and you've lost that project, it could have a massive impact on that school. The community energy group has absolutely no influence on what's going to happen with the school. The DFE does, and Treasury does. And therefore, we are a much cheaper way for Treasury and the taxman to basically insure these projects and allow bondholders to invest in them at a low return, low risk, rather than funding them themselves through GB Energy. So it's like GB Energy can fund all of it, and that's all coming out of the public loans book effectively, or they could allow other people to fund 90% of them, and occasionally when one of the projects drops out, they'll fund that project at that point. So we've actually drafted some wording with the DFE around providing for that type of contingent liability, not because we particularly want to put the CBS, but because we think it'd be the right thing to do to crowd money in at low cost whilst protecting bondholders.
And local authority procurement rules,
And the
navigation
local
around that.
procurement rules. So um, they all get in a very big muddle about this. So there's a fork at the road right at the beginning of the conversation, and that is, are you going to just provide the roof to someone else to put solar panels on it? Or are you going to partly fund that system? If you're going to partly fund that system, you need to go through procurement. If all you're doing is providing the roof, You don't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but they get a bit confused about this, and some councils are completely on board with it, and others go round and round in circles. Um, but generally speaking, if the council's not paying for it, they don't have to go for procurement. The school, on the other hand, might have to go through some form of procurement. Relatively light touch, but the school has to show that they've made a choice based on some criteria. It doesn't have to be the cheapest option, but for example, and what we're trying to do to help them with that is in sort of options for schools is when we're talking to school, we don't just show them what it would look like if it was funded by the CBS, but we also show them what it would look like if it was funded by the local community energy group or a commercial provider. The commercial providers are sometimes slightly cheaper, but they don't get the governance and the benefit. So they then say that we've chosen the CBS, even though there was this other option that was slightly cheaper, for these reasons. And just that, and that's enough at a school level to get through procurement. You know, if a council wants to fund the projects, then they don't need to go for a procurement process.
How's that split? So you're going to stay to 220. How much roughly is the latter versus the former?
So for the CBS ones,
Yeah.
see, that's not entirely true. I was about to say they're all funded entirely by the CBS, but that's not true. So Leeds Council has partly funded the project because they had some decarbonisation budget to do that, and they were putting heat pumps
So
in.
it's a minority thing.
But it's a minority.
Yeah.
And it also depends on what they're doing. So Sheffield is paid for some sort of pre-development work. And so they procured us or about to procure us for the next stage of work or going through a procurement process to hopefully procure us. And this is options. But it depends. Most of the schools in the CBS, eventually the council realize they don't have to go through procurement because they're not actually paying for it.
Okay. Good. Rob, thanks very much for those questions. I don't see any more questions. Robert, thanks again for your time and everything you're doing. FX will follow up with an email to everyone who registered, and a recording will be available on YouTube and on our website. So thanks very much to everyone. Thanks to Robert, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Jerome.
Bye.
Thanks. And thanks to all our bondholders out there we've got over 1,000 now in the CBS, and they've been incredibly supportive, and many of them invest multiple times over multiple years. So if any of you are listening, thank you.
Thanks, Robert.